Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another lovely history lesson with me, Miss Warren. Today we are going to cover the interwar years, because this would be an instrumental time in going from the First World War, the end of it, the aftermath, and then beyond, or up to World War II. So we are really going to look at the meaning of this, kind of limbo years between World War I and World War II. And this cartoon that you see in front of you is a very interesting cartoon that kind of starts to lay the foundation of what would end up becoming, um, you know, the Axis powers and, what fueled World War II. So we will talk about this in class. So today's objective is really talking about, what the conditions were in Europe and how you had the rise of totalitarianism, fascism, Nazis and Hitler, Stalin and communism, like how all of this were steps to World War II. So let's get at it, shall we? So, first and foremost, there were a lot of problems in Europe. So, only Japan and the United States were left in better shape after World War I. Everyone else had been completely devastated, countries bombed, um, countrysides, carved up for trench warfare. And then you started to see new democracies starting to form after World War I in Europe, but they weren't in the greatest of shape. Like they were just kind of created and then thrown to the wolves to see what would happen. They weren't really, you know, nobody walked them through in this whole self-determination age. And then France itself went through 40 different governmental changes in 20 years. So from 1919 to 1939, they went through 40 different changes, and I can't tell you how many constitutions before landing themselves in World War II again, or in another world war. People during this time were extremely dissatisfied with their governments, and this is where you really see the dissolution of monarchies start, going throughout all of Europe, and you start to see people demanding more involvement in their government because people were tired of suffering and people were ready for a change. Now, in Germany, in particular, they were going through it, y'all. Like they were really going through it. The Weimar Republic had been formed in Germany. They were blamed for the defeat in World War II and blamed for the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, Germany did not have a choice in signing the Treaty of Versailles. It was sign it or face the consequences. And Germany, because of it, owed $33 billion in war reparations to Great Britain and France specifically, and also a few other countries, but in particular, Great Britain and France. And to pay for it, Germany didn't raise taxes, they just printed more money. Well, they couldn't raise taxes because nobody had a job. The Treaty of Versailles limited Germany's ability for any economic expansion or any economic growth because it took away their moneymaker, the Alsace-Lorraine region of the Rhine. And then it greatly limited how many people they could have in their military. And the military is the largest employer of any country. So, how can you raise taxes on people that don't have a job? So, they just printed more money. And that means that when you have too much of something, that means the value of it plummets as well, even with money. This is called hyperinflation. When you print so much money that you have this extreme devaluation of money. So in 1918, just before the war ended, a loaf of bread cost 1 German mark. In 1922, it was 160. In 1923, it was worth 200 billion German marks. So I want to point out to you that this woman here is using German money to light her kitchen stove because it was cheaper to burn the money than to buy firewood. This little kid is playing with bricks of money. I want you to take a second and actually think about this. Think about having a stack of $100 bills, but not being able to buy anything with it. It's cheaper to burn it for fuel than it is to buy fuel with it. That's what happened to the German people. And their entire life savings was now just worthless. So the US bails Germany out. It's called the Dawes Plan. It's basically, we are going to give Germany a no interest loan that has no end date on it, just so Germany can, kind of get back on their feet. But the problem is that when the US, what happens? Like, what happens? One, what happens to that money? And two, what happens when the US dollar goes away? Like, would Germany find themselves right back in the same position? Would it devalue our money here in the United States? Like, what actually happens? So then you have the creation of the League of Nations. This was one of the points in the Treaty of Versailles, and its main goal was disarmament, preventing a new war, settling disputes in a, more diplomatic way, go through negotiations. It was just to promote diplomacy, and it was to put Europe back together. But unfortunately, the United States wasn't involved in the thing that they were promoting. It was greatly ineffective. There was no control over major conflicts, there was no progress in disarmament, and there was no effective military force. So basically, it had no power. So in the 1920s, while Europe was going through this economic depression already, and Germany was hit really hard, the US was booming. This was when we were hitting our industrial age, and life was great. Wages were up 40%. But wealth was definitely not evenly distributed. The richest 5% get 33% of the income, while the other 60% of families were making less than $2,000 a year. That's not a lot of money. Like, even back then, that was not a lot of money. Factories were used to produce large amounts of good, but the people made very little money, so they couldn't even buy the goods that they were producing. So factories don't need to produce as much, so they start to lay off workers. And now they have even less money. And then this starts to spiral downwards. And in the stock market was soaring. So people, because there were not a lot of goods or not a lot of new goods, people started investing in the stock market so that they could get rich quick. So they would invest, wait a little bit, sell it off, and make a lot of money. This was a fad in the 1920s to get involved in the market. But because of this, 80% of the population had no savings. None whatsoever. So there were some red flags here. Because we were trying to be a truly capitalist country, banks were not insured. There were no government agencies to monitor these banks or the stock market. The market value was based primarily on, borrowed dollars and over speculation instead of real value. And speculation just means that it's the perceived value of something, right? So this increased personal debt. So people were now going and borrowing money to invest in the stock market. This meant that there was a lot of debt going all the way around because people thought that if they borrowed money to invest in the stock market, that they could make money off of it and pay that debt back. Yeah, there's some red flags. There are a lot of red flags here. So the hyperinflation in Germany just did, it just gets worse and worse and worse. As you see from this little graph, the US is here. Like it starts giving money to Germany here. But things in Germany just keep getting worse and worse. It does not get any better. And then you have what's called Black Thursday. On October 24th, 1929, the stock markets fall drastically. And there is what's called a broker's panic. That means that the major people involved here start to lose a lot of money. So GE, like General Electric, falls from 400 a share to 283 a share. That's a huge dip. So brokers make what's called margin calls. That means no one can pay. So the stock market completely crashes because nobody can pay. So everything is being devalued. Like we have inflated the value of everything and then all of a sudden realize that it's not worth anything because nobody can buy it. So this leads to Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. This is when stock markets completely plunge, like bottom out. The value of the market falls. People sell what's left so that they can get some money. And by the end of October, so 2 days later, they had lost over $30 billion. And hundreds of thousands of people lose everything. Like legit lose everything. And unfortunately, the stock market wouldn't even begin to recover until, World War, like the 30s, like World War II, essentially. So the immediate effects, like people lost everything in the stock market. Banks and brokers, start to call in loans, but people have no money because they invested everything. So hundreds of banks end up closing because there's no money to pay the bank loans, which means their savings accounts were absolutely empty. And because their accounts were empty, the banks were not prepared for people to withdraw any money at any point in time. And because there was no bank insurance, it meant that they couldn't go to anybody to say, hey, I need to borrow some money, or I need to call in my insurance policy so that these people can give money. Because what happens is when you put your money into a bank, the bank looks at all the money that they have in these accounts and says, okay, we can lend out X number of dollars based on cash on hand. But at this point in time, there was no cash on hand to lend out any money. So these banks started to call in their loans so that they could have cash on hand. Since they had no money to lend, that meant that they had no money on hand to give people back their money. So that means people didn't have money and the banks didn't have money. So 9 million savings account just vanish. So for the first time in history, banks completely close because people start making a run on the bank. And this meant that democracy was in crisis. So as a result of this worldwide depression, this creates a breeding ground for dictators. Since Germany was hit the hardest, they were extremely dependent on US loans. Well, now the US can't loan any money because the US doesn't have any money. So Germany had already been through this in 1923, but they were bailed out by the US. But Germany doesn't want to do this again because that makes them dependent on a foreign country. And people of foreign countries were looking for anyone to help. Democracy is not providing the immediate needs of people because at this time, democracy and capitalism, true capitalism, were hand in hand, and true capitalism was failing. So people begin to lose faith in their governments. So they start looking for strong leaders. They start looking at totalitarian and militaristic dictatorships to take over. So you have Benito Mussolini, who rises in Italy, and he creates fascism. So it comes in response to a bad economy, fear of communism, because people didn't want to go that drastic with it. Italy was in particular disappointed that they didn't gain any territory out of the Treaty of Versailles. So Mussolini takes over. He is Il Duce, 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 yeah, Duce. There we go. Which means the leader. And he abolished all the parties except for his. He used the police to jail his opponents. And Mussolini and Hitler form an alliance. And Japan would later jump on that bandwagon. And I want to point out that Italy and Japan were on the Allied side in World War One, but because they were completely left out of the conversation in the Treaty of Versailles, that totally ticked off Italy and it ticked off Japan. So they flip. They actually join the Axis side. So what's fascism? Well, fascism is a political movement that does promote an extreme form of nationalism, and it denies the individual rights of people, and it places a dictatorial party in rule, like one singular party, and they have absolute control. But what fascism does is it does work well with democracy. It means that they push to revive an economy and they were going to punish the ones that were responsible for the hard times. So in Hitler and Mussolini's case, they blamed the Jewish people for it. And they sought to restore national pride through pushing the revival of the economy. This attracted those who felt angered and betrayed by the results of World War II or World War I rather, and also the Depression. So loyalty to the state and obedience to a singular dictator was what you needed. And this takes power in Italy, Germany, and in Spain. Now, in Japan, you have Hirohito. Hirohito is the emperor, but the emperor doesn't really have a whole lot of say. Japan too is suffering from the depression, so the military takes over. Hirohito becomes the face of Japan, but the military under Hideki Tojo would control Japan, and they actually sought to conquer in order to solve their problems. In Germany, you have Hitler. Enough said, right? He established a totalitarian dictatorship in the 1930s and brings Germany out of the depression, and he rules with an iron fist. Which, by the way, he wrote an entire book in prison called Mein Kampf, where he said, if I was in charge of Germany, this is what I would do. And he was checking boxes when he became leader of Germany. Also, fun fact, Volkswagen means people's car. Was Hitler's idea. Volkswagen doesn't want to really talk about that side of history. So Nazis come to control literally everything. So German soldiers are 100% dissatisfied. So the Nazi party is able to come in and take over. So Hitler remains in the army and is sent to spy on meetings of the German Workers' Party. He became the 55th member. In the 1920s, he actually quits the army. The party changes its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And by July 1921, Hitler is named president of the Nazis. And they called him Führer, and they start introducing the Heil Hitler, and the Nazi salute, and the flag, and the swastika, which, by the way, this swastika was actually stolen from Hinduism. Yeah, we're going to talk about that. But this was all Hitler's idea. And mind you, this is Hitler in World War One. Just so you know. So then you have what's called the Beer Hall Putsch, which happens in November 8th of 1923. This is when Nazis tried to control the Munich government. 16 Nazis and 3 police die in the fighting, and Hitler is arrested and sent to prison. This is where he writes Mein Kampf, which means my struggle, and lays out his plan. And basically in Mein Kampf, it says that all Germans, especially those who are blonde hair and blue-eyed, were the perfect Aryans, the master race, and all non-Aryans were inferior and needed extermination. I'm a part of that. Redhead. Hitler would have actually taken me and done experiments on me to figure out why I have red hair. Yeah, that's a thing. Red hair and freckles. Would have been the perfect experiment, and I never would have lived like 6 months afterwards. We'll talk about that. So the Treaty of Versailles outraged Hitler. And he vowed to get back all the lands that were taken and to restore national pride. Germany just needed the Lebensraum, or living space. And that would get space by conquering Eastern Europe and Russia. So in the late 1924 year, Hitler was released. In 1930, the Depression hits the economy pretty hard and collapses. And that's just what the Nazis needed to gain power. So before this, it was just like a little fly in the room. But after 1930, or in 1930, the Nazi Party would be a growing movement and it would cause fear. So the Nazis became the largest political party in Germany. In 32, Hitler runs for president and is defeated by Hindenburg. So Hindenburg, knowing that the Nazi Party was a threat, makes Hitler chancellor in order to tame him. And Hitler would then gain power legally. Hindenburg would die, and Hitler, in that night, would gain control by taking out all of his opponents and becoming, the official president and chancellor of Germany. Now, in Russia, you have communism. This was the extreme left wing. It was based completely on the theory by Karl Marx that we talked about, where the state owned everything. And Soviet communism, called Stalinism, was more of a totalitarian and military state that combined elements of communism. So even Soviet Russia was not pure communist. Stalin was arguably worse than Hitler. Actually, he is worse than Hitler. Stalin takes, firm control of the government. He develops a cult-like personality around him, nearly defies Lenin in every way, shape, or form. And he makes himself Lenin's successor by eliminating all of his enemies. Oh, yeah, it would not go great. So what's up with Japan? Well, Japan is an island. They lack natural resources and farmland. So they had no room to grow. So they took one from the European book and start empire building. They took over Manchuria. They aligned with Germany and Italy. They signed a neutrality agreement with Soviet Russia. And they started to push into Southeast Asia and Indonesia, all in reach or in search of raw materials. And they wanted total control over the over the Pacific. But guess who got in their way? So by the 30s, Hirohito, the emperor, was very weak. Japan invaded Manchuria for their mineral-rich resources. Japan just needs these materials, and the world just sits and watches because so far it's not our problem. Then Mussolini from Italy invades Ethiopia, inspired by Japan's attacks on Manchuria, because the League of Nations has no power. So Italy invades. The League condemned the attack, but ultimately does nothing. Britain and France are too afraid of causing another world war that they try to keep the peace by appeasing the Italians. So the world just sits back and watches. Well, Hitler is over here going, well, if these two are getting away with it, what can we do? So Hitler begins secretly building an army again, which they're not supposed to do. League of Nations condemns Hitler for this, but does nothing. So Hitler was like, okay, you did nothing then. So what if we reoccupy the Rhineland, the Alsace-Lorraine region? So they did, and nothing happened. The Allies resort to what's called appeasement, this policy of giving in to an aggressor in order to maintain peace, to establish a balance, like to keep the balance of power equal. Well, this actually ended up shifting the balance of power to Germany. Now Belgium and France are open to attack because German military officers are occupying this region. So Hitler is now able to speed up plans for his world domination. So you have now the Axis. Mussolini and Hitler form an alliance, and Japan joins another month later. Then over in Spain, you have the Spanish Civil War. Francisco Franco revolts against the democratic government. Millions of Italian and German volunteers went to Spain with tanks, guns, subs, planes, whatever they needed to help out Franco. Western democracies stay completely neutral. They just sit back and watch. This war would be practice for World War II. What's happening in the US? Well, they're just minding their own business. We are going through a really bad time. So we put America first. We truly become isolationists. That means we are not intervening whatsoever in Europe's chaos. This was America's foreign policy from the end of World War I to December 7th, 1941. What happens on December 7th, 1941, you ask? We'll get there. So the German Reich expands. 1937, Hitler announces that he wants parts of Austria back and parts of Czechoslovakia, and they get it. This is called the Anschluss, or Union, and Hitler plans to form a Third Reich. So he invades Austria. France and Britain do nothing. He turned to Czechoslovakia. France and Britain do nothing. 3 million ethnic Germans live in Western Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. The Czechs refuse and ask for help. And at the Munich conference, Germany, Great Britain, France, and Italy meet to decide the fate. Hitler gets the Sudetenland because of appeasement. Great Britain and France do nothing to stop. Do nothing to stop. So Germany is getting everything that he wants. He ends up annexing not just the Sudetenland, he ends up annexing everything. Because you give an inch, they take a mile. So, just before Hitler officially starts World War II with the occupation of Poland, he goes to Russia because he fears Stalin. So France and Britain actually are the first ones to go to Russia, and Russia was not interested because they felt betrayed after World War I. So Russia wanted a better deal. Stalin and Hitler signed what's called a non-aggression pact, stating that they would never attack each other. Poland is secretly divided into a buffer zone. Hitler gets one part, Russia stays out of the other part. They basically agree to not get involved in each other's affairs. And this means that Hitler is officially ready to take over. So he plans to invade Poland. Britain and France pledge to help Poland if Germany invades. They see what's coming. And so on September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. World War II officially begins, and Hitler unleashes what's called the Blitzkrieg. And that's just, shock and awe. Like, hit them when they least expect it. Britain and France officially declare war on Germany as Russia remains neutral, and so does America. We stay out of it. All right, so next time I see you, we are going to pick up with World War II. See you all later.